My friends, what is the greatest threat to the United States in the Americas? If you said China, you were right. China is the ultimate target of all the operations that Donald Trump is carrying out on our continent, including in Brazil. And many people ask here in the comments, but China won't get out of this so easily. It won't be easy. Trump won't achieve absolutely anything. And to prove to you that this is already happening, I brought Paulo Henrique Araujo directly from the corridors of Washington in a fantastic partnership with the Shimon Oliveira channel. Paulo Henrique, let's trace the path of Chinese decline with everything that has happened in the last few weeks, which proves that China is cornered, and a cornered beast. A cornered dragon can bite and bite hard. Paulo Henrique, what's coming from the United States?
Well, my friend, I'll tell you, an important report came out from a think tank that's not exactly aligned with the Republican Party or Donald Trump, showing that, yes, the actions are having an effect. It's from the Atlantic Council. And the Atlantic Council presented a dossier here in Washington at its headquarters detailing the positive results of President Donald Trump's agenda to contain China's economic influence. And then they're going to highlight several points, right? Mainly the ones that Trump has been bringing up since his first administration, which was the tariff war. Everything we're seeing about tariffs, Brazil is now in the middle of all this, of this whole mess that's affecting the entire world, right? Unfortunately, our president ended up taking this to the diplomatic level, which only made things worse. But China had already been in this fight with Donald Trump since his first administration, and this has been gaining more and more strength, okay? Yeah, this Chinese offensive in the Caribbean and throughout the Latin American region also started to be blocked mainly by the Shield of the Americas. And the report points this out because there, within the Shield of the Americas, the National Security Report was released in November 2025 by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. He highlights several points that indirectly address Chinese issues, especially those related to hybrid warfare. So we're talking here about drug trafficking, organized crime for money laundering, and also the direct agreements involving the countries, right? And when we look at it, Brazil is making headlines in all these confrontations with the United States of America, and that's not by chance, okay? Because today Brazil is one of China's major allies in the West, and this is isolating Brazil. So let's separate the topics here. There's a direct clash between the United States and China over tariffs. However, within the scope of the Shield of the Americas, there's also the issue of fighting international drug trafficking. Does that mean China was bringing cocaine into the United States? No. But the American government already points out, and President Donald Trump himself, the large flow of fentanyl used to make synthetic drugs. And this fentanyl would be coming in precisely through the major drug cartels that already traffic marijuana and cocaine, like the Tren de Aragua, the Sinaloa cartel, among others, right? The Jalisco New Generation cartel, whose leader was killed at the beginning of the year, among other points. And they were indeed used by China. In addition, all the Chinese influence in various countries in the region as well. And they talk about some important countries like Panama, for example, El Salvador. They mention Argentina and Brazil. Colombia is also mentioned as a country going through a change now, with Abelardo de las Priedias about to take office, but Brazil still remains an enigma in all of this. And it says that the United States are the major investors and have never stopped being in Latin America. And here, understand that there's a difference between being an investor and being a buyer. And that's the point. China started to greatly increase its influence by buying raw materials. It's almost like something is extractivist. So this Chinese extractivism brings a lot of money to certain sectors, but it doesn't help the development of the countries. So they present several figures there showing that the United States is increasing this investment in the countries within the framework of the Shield of the Americas. An example that, in fact, I talk a lot about and they mention is Paraguay. Paraguay is engaged in broad cooperation in various ways in almost every area. Santiago Peña, who is the Paraguayan president with President Donald Trump. So we have military cooperation there, including American troops that are already inside Paraguay, cooperation to combat international terrorism in the tri-border area, especially to combat money laundering, and the United States is making investments. For example, Brazil in the Itaipu Binational Project, which is a construction built by both the Brazilian and Paraguayan governments back in the 1970s. Brazil used to buy all the surplus electricity from Itaipu. But then there started to be a big mess to renew the sale of this additional energy to Brazil. And then Lula's government had the brilliant idea to start doing what, Shimon? Spying on Paraguay. And this was discovered. Here in Brazil, this was kept very hidden, but in 2025, it was all over the newspapers almost 24 hours a day. A spying scheme where they spied on the Senate, the president of the Senate, and several senators, the presidency of Paraguay, and the vice presidency as well. And this pushed the Paraguayan government even further away from Brazil diplomatically. What happened? The United States, with this closer alignment within the shield of the Americas, did the following. Let's buy this surplus electricity. And then you might ask, but hey, is there a difference? A big one. How do you transport electricity? That doesn't make sense. That's where investment comes in. One of the biggest bottlenecks we have today with the advent of artificial intelligence is, besides critical minerals, rare minerals and electricity. These are two very big bottlenecks we have. So the United States will start building gigantic data centers inside Paraguay. Then it will be powered with this energy, surplus energy to provide services, right? Like intelligence, communication, data analysis for the United States of America, and more than that, Shimon. They are heavily investing in recruiting and developing Paraguayan professionals to serve this industry. Look at the difference we have compared to what China does. So there are several examples. For example, in Ecuador, we have actions. Military operations are taking place between the Ecuadorian army and the U.S. Army to expel several Marxist guerrilla groups, and also to eliminate several groups there that handle all the drug trafficking from Ecuadorian territory through the Pacific Ocean route. So there are several points that the Atlantic Council shows where the American government is indeed managing to reduce Chinese momentum, but they also point out that there are still several sectors where the United States needs to improve, okay? To permanently distance themselves from this Chinese position. And what they point out is precisely the issue of critical minerals. People always talk about it very superficially, just in passing, but it's one of the main points of the entire diplomatic crisis we're facing. And Brazil had a golden opportunity. Why? The United States, they're willing not just to come, or rather in this case, not just to go and extract these rare minerals from Brazil like China does. What did the United States want to do? Implement structures within Brazil, train local workers, and bring investments so that this mining could happen inside Brazil. And that says a lot about sovereignty. But you also need to have strategic, geopolitical, and even military alignment, because it's one of the most important security issues we have today. On the other hand, China, they just want to extract. And what did we see Lula saying 2 weeks ago in a ministerial meeting, that leaked audio from Lula? No, Trump is jealous of China because China has a lot of rare minerals. Then you say, well, if we're discussing things in these terms with a man who should be looking out for the country's development, things get pretty complicated, doesn't it, Shimon?
You sum it up as your enemy or your opponent is just jealous, right? That's the level of reasoning. That's the level of reality that Lula lives in, or that he wants Brazilians to live in, right? Trump, he's nothing. He's just jealous, right? Now, here's the thing, Paulo. So we have actions. And it's kind of a natural thing, right? Where there's one power, the other isn't. It can't establish itself there because it seems like there's only room for one superpower, right? So, with the United States entering Paraguay, Venezuela, now Colombia, Argentina, and even Brazil, there's not much room for China. Why is that? Because they both compete more or less, right, in the same sectors, and that's interesting, isn't it? Because look, telecommunications, the United States also has things to offer Brazil, right? Mining also has something to offer. Now, one thing is real, right? If the Americans don't invest, China comes in and invests. But there's this difference, right? It's very clear. China buys, and those who only buy pay very little, right? Those who invest in processing and industrialization, and that's what China doesn't do, right? Spend much more money. And that's where the question of being a long-term partner comes in.
Long-term partner, right?
Exactly. It's a long-term partner. And then even the American tariffs come into play. They reflect that. Why is that? For the United States to enter Brazil, it's much more expensive than for China to enter Brazil, right? Because Brazil has this restrictive economic policy where for an international company to start manufacturing here, it's devoured by taxes, bureaucracy, and everything else. China doesn't face that. China comes in, sets up, and puts the squeeze on Brazilian workers. As we saw Paulo Henrique Araujo, another case of a worker getting beaten up in Camaçari. That's what's happening again, man.
Yeah, the other case we had happened at the Medea factory in Minas Gerais. That's China.
For those who don't know, Medea is Chinese.
Exactly. And the Chinese, they invest a lot of money in infrastructure. And what's happening there in Camaçari, okay? Yeah, in Camaçari, they bought Ford's plant. Ford left Brazil, right, mainly because of the terrible situation we had there in the post-pandemic period, which was a global problem. But for Ford, it just wasn't worth staying in Brazil anymore. So they bought the plant there to turn it into a BYD factory, and they're expanding it. But what happens? This expansion needs bricklayers and everything else. And the workers there in Bahia now, they're in a really tough confrontation with the Chinese. They're starting to film how the Chinese are working in this regard. So look, the foreman is Chinese. Almost all the management there is Chinese. They hire the cheapest Brazilian labor they can find. But they're filming, there's video of this. The guy is filming the foreman with a stick in his hand, and then he starts talking. The guy doesn't understand Portuguese, right? The Chinese guy, the foreman. So he look at this, the guy here, look how he stands with a stick in his hand and keeps filming. And then when he thinks the guy isn't working well, he goes and hits the people with the stick. And there's the Chinese guy building the wall inside a hole, and the guy is behind him with a stick. Then he goes over to the Brazilian guy and he says, look, that's a Brazilian. The Brazilian is really clever. They've already learned some words in Chinese and they start giving some hints. Stop, because stop hints at something in Chinese. The guy looks and says, that's a Brazilian. If you mess with him, it'll go badly for you. So it's already happening. It's at that level. The guys are filming. It's at that level. Why? Because these guys work by beating up workers. But what happened? He only hit the Chinese guy. No, the Chinese guy is inside Brazil and the crime is being committed within national territory. And then I ask,
because over there in China, it's not, look, over there in China, it's not a crime. Over there in China, watching employees isn't a crime there. Sometimes I wish I were there, the customer. But over there in China, it's not a crime to monitor them. That's exactly what they go there to do. Now in Brazil, it is. And it is. And who is the president of Brazil, Paulo? Isn't he the father of the poor, the father of the workers?
that's right, a union leader, a big supporter of China, pretty much, right? Brazil is being neo-colonized by China in several ways, okay? And that's a very serious thing. I wrote a short article this week, Shimon. If you think it's interesting for the audience, we can discuss it later. And he doesn't say absolutely anything about these accusations. I keep imagining, my dear Shimon, I'm just picturing it just for a moment, okay? If this were, for example, a factory that's manufacturing something, let's say an HP factory, for example, some American brand,
Abosh.
Good.
Abosh.
Imagine that in a Bosch factory, huh? And if this was happening, wouldn't it be all over the media? Statements condemning it, Lula shouting on the stage. What would be happening? Stop and ask yourselves about that. But when we look at it from this point of view, right? Yeah, when it comes to China, Lula stays silent. And that's something that really stands out, really, my friend.
Actually, part of the tariffs, 12 now, which will add up to 12 and
12
and a half, which will add up to 25, right? That was applied because of slave labor, right?
And that fits into this China-related picture.
That comes into the Chinese scenario and JBS. Two friends of the king, huh? Two friends of the king. The Chinese Communist Party, and that's a scandal. The Chinese Communist Party that controls companies that set up in Brazil. In other words, it's not BYD. It's the party that's going to rule that territory, right? And the territory, by the way, is completely filled with censors and uncertainties. Dual purpose, military and civilian within Brazil, right? And then you have the king's other friend, right? Jose Joesley Batista, the JF Group, JIF, who benefited from the state bank BNDES to build the empire. And today, right, they enjoy the benefits that the king creates every time he comes to power. So guys, look, the United States, they're coming at us with everything they've got. And they're pointing the finger for the whole world to see. Brazil, the Brazilian government, is complicit in Chinese practices of enslaving people. It's that simple, right? Only those who don't understand can't see it. And this is being so normalized. And then you mentioned something interesting, right? It's not in the media. If it were another company, an American company, or even a Brazilian company, it would be at the Supreme Federal Court, Paulo. A German one, it would be at the Supreme Federal Court. It would become a Supreme Federal Court issue. The company would be shut down. Suddenly, it would be invaded by unions and paralyzed. How many times have we seen car manufacturers shut down in São Paulo? Shut down, right? Yes.
Did this movement start? Lula.
Lula himself. The union doesn't do anything. Well, and then you see the contrast, right? Because BID is in all the media, pouring money in all the media. You see ads for this Chinese state-owned company everywhere you can imagine. Even here, look. We're talking about China and BID. Don't be surprised if a BID ad pops up here, look, in this conversation, because they're everywhere. We don't control the ads here on YouTube, okay, guys? We're not the ones who choose what comes in and what goes out, right? It's the platform itself that sends out the ads. So, everything is controlled. The Americans point this out. The Americans denounce this. The Americans are shouting about this. It's about Chinese influence. And even this week, a huge report is coming out, right? That points to the involvement of Russia, China, the communists, the globalists, and the global left. Yeah, even including Brazil in that Marco Rubio report that talks about Cuba. But before we talk about Cuba, we're going to talk about something that happened recently, just this week, about Nicaragua. The dictator of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, has just declared that there will be no more elections in Nicaragua. Well, he was already a dictator, so it wasn't really news, but he made something very clear that draws attention. Why? Because the United States is coming down hard on our continent, right? On the Americas, right? Yeah, either it's desperation or he's got a lot of nerve to beat his chest and say, look, this is a dictatorship. Right? Even though the dictator was just arrested, taken to the United States, and will be tried there. In fact, the date of his trial has already been set. Paulo, if you have that information, we can talk a little about it in this segment. Yeah, how did Nicaragua react? We saw that Marco Rubio already made a statement right away. Look, I'm calling on the nations, the democratic nations, to save democracy in Nicaragua. Paulo, will there be new actions there?
Well, look, if you allow me, brother Shimon, this connects directly with what we were talking about, right? And I'm going to tie this together. Let's go. I made a post this week, really short here, 2 paragraphs, a paragraph and a half, to be honest, talking exactly about Brazil's position, this issue with China, and how we're going to connect this, okay? Because here's the thing, look at what I wrote. By antagonizing the United States to the point of almost breaking off commercial and political relations, Lula and his regime are trying to lock Brazil behind an iron curtain, where the country, isolated from all its South American neighbors and from the superpower of the democratic world, will end up completely in the hands of organized crime, corruption, and terrorism. Our nation will also be at the mercy of Chinese totalitarianism, thus consolidating the criminal socialist power system that is already being implemented. And why is this important here? How does this connect to Nicaragua? Nicaragua, Shimon, it has a role that is often hidden, okay? In my book, The Sao Paulo Forum and the Great Homeland, I specifically addressed the foundations of how the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua was what made the creation of the Sao Paulo Forum possible. And moreover, it was from Nicaragua that they took the model of infiltration in various parts of society, especially within the Catholic Church with liberation theology, and after that came the integral mission, right, which is derived from this and was introduced into evangelical circles so that the PT could become popular, okay, in the most remote areas and provide the foundation for Lula's rise back in 2002. And the government obviously starts in 2003. So this issue of Daniel Ortega, the Sandinista revolution, the connection it has with Brazil is much deeper than just he's a friend. No, he's a friend, but it's more than that.
He's the mentor.
He's the mentor. The foundation of what led the PT to become what it is comes from the Sandinista revolution. I have all the details, the names, the people, the dates of all of this.
That's not so widely known, right? Lula's connection is much more closely linked to Cuba than to Nicaragua, right? And now it makes perfect sense for Marco Rubio to shout from over there.
That's right. So, Shimon, what do we have? There's information that I myself, modesty aside, managed to uncover that nobody else knew about. I cross-checked several sources to determine when Lula and Fidel Castro met and first made contact. For many years, it was said that this happened around 85 or 87. And I can tell you for sure, it was there at the first anniversary celebration of the Sandinista Revolution in 1980 in Nicaragua. I have this confirmed in the book in Nicaragua, cross-checking several sources, okay? Sources including Cuban defectors and so on. Yeah, documents from that time. And I can show this and how the PT is a creation of the Sandinista Revolution, okay? With the support of Dom Evaristo Arns, with the support of Daniel Ortega himself, and leaders we had inside there. From the university environment, the scheme, it's huge. All of this is documented in my book, The Sao Paulo Forum is Pátria Grande. And what happens now, my friend? Now, Daniel Ortega said he won't hold elections anymore to prevent the coup plotters from taking power. Look how crazy that is, right? Because he says that through elections he will lose power, so that would be a coup d'etat. And there are videos of Lula saying exactly that, defending Daniel Ortega. But Angela Merkel stayed in power for so many years, I don't know who else, so why can't Daniel Ortega? Then the Spanish reporter who was answering him said, but they were there, they were elected, there was continuity, and they didn't arrest or persecute political opponents like Daniel Ortega does, right? And then Lula has that look on his face like he doesn't know how to respond, right? That's how deep the ties go. So what do we have then? Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was on this international mission, said the following on his official X account. The Trump administration and the international community will not stand by while the Murillo Ortega dictatorship. Why Murillo? Rosario Murillo, Daniel Ortega's wife, and he gave her a position, okay? President, co-president.
Yes.
She is co-president. Yeah, there are two presidents in Nicaragua, him and his wife. Can you imagine if his friends start doing the same thing?
It's a family business, right? But you see, here in Brazil, kind of behind the scenes, that was already happening, right? Yeah, yeah. Over there in Eastern America, right? East America and Brussels. In Brussels, let's use that keyword. In Brussels, there's a president whose wife decided which ministers he could talk to. She decided which meetings he could attend. She decided who he could take pictures with. There in Brussels, right? Brussels, over there in Eastern America. And it's very similar. We also had the president of Brussels at an event. I don't know if it was last year's CELAC, where he said that elections aren't everything. He said that too, right? He made that statement, right? At some point, they'll have to abolish elections, right? Anyway, so yeah, this Brussels is very similar, right?
It's very similar. And in Brussels, there are a lot of judges who make decisions, arrest opponents, and interfere in elections, right? Yeah, that happens a lot in Nicaragua. I've seen people from Brussels complaining about it too. But getting back to Marco Rubio, right? After this aside, the Trump administration and the international community will not stand idly by. While the Murillo Ortega dictatorship deepens repression at home and creates instability that threatens the national security of the United States of America, Ortega's commitment to abolish elections in Nicaragua proves his cowardice and fear of the will of the Nicaraguan people. That's right. And Ortega, he is, and Lula is, this is information I'm giving, okay? It's not a guess. I'm not just throwing things out there or anything. They were extremely worried about Maduro's arrest, okay? Yeah, the information I got is that Lula, in the first few days, he had trouble, okay, even handling his commitments, sleeping, handling his commitments, and all that. That's how worried he was.
Fear.
Paulo.
Lula confessed in a campaign speech that every night, look at what he said. Every night I remember what happened in Venezuela. Right? Every night I remember that Comrade Maduro was taken away. Right? As if a spaceship had abducted Maduro. And then there's also information that he went to consult the Brazilian generals, the military. Right? If Brazil would be able to prevent a military action like the one the United States carried out in Venezuela, given the concern. And he still doesn't sleep well to this day. Because for those who have a plan, Paulo Henrique and you, dear viewer, by the way, leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell, because it's hard work to bring Paulo Henrique Araujo here, huh? And follow him there too. Look. By the way, yeah, on this topic about Lula, he even talked about investing in national security, investing in Brazil's sovereignty, hinting at sending some money to the Brazilian army, but that didn't happen. Absolutely nothing, Paulo.
That's right, my friend. So this shows the level of concern there is and why Lula has been using this kind of speech more and more, right? He even said this week that Marco Rubio, if he wants, can set up a campaign committee to help his opponent in the elections, and he wouldn't care at all, right? Look at the level things have reached in Lula's speeches. Now, do you know what the point is and how it relates to Maduro and all of this? The one who did this was actually Lula himself. In 2010, 2011, actually, after he left the presidency, Lula said the following: if Comrade Chavez loses the elections in Venezuela, it's like the fall of the Berlin Wall. Do you know what he did? He set up a campaign committee where he and Jose Dirceu coordinated everything. And more than that, he set up a money laundering scheme to finance his friend Chavez's campaign through the construction companies, among them Odebrecht, okay? I also have all of this in my book, documented with testimonies, evidence, sources, everything nicely organized. And Mrs. Monica Mora was the one who reported all of this during Operation Car Wash, right? But as we know, Operation Car Wash was buried, and Lula, because of his address, was taken out of jail and put there in the presidency of Brazil, my friend.
Look, folks, I just want to give a quick message before we talk about Cuba because what Marco Rubio revealed about Cuba is really something. It brings the whole system down. It destroys the entire plan that was set up for Brazil to become the new Cuba. But that's why the system doesn't want channels like this one, like Paulo Henrique Araujo, who speaks directly from the halls of Washington to prosper. But they still haven't been able to stop us. And I'm running for the Ibesti Award as a political influencer, counting on your support, on your vote. We went from the 44th position when we were nominated, and today we're in first place, thanks to the power of our community. So click the link now, which is in the description and in the first pinned comment, and cast your vote. We have to hold on to first place until next Tuesday the 28th, which is when the qualification for the next round happens. And we have definitely entered the top 20 in Brazil. And there, folks, we are competing with the worst of the left. Yes, and if you understand the power of influence these guys have in Brazil, we are in the right place to fight the wrong guys, right? They should never be the focus of Brazilians' attention. But no, they're there in Brazil's top 20 leftists who were mourning the death of Ayatollah Khamenei and who cried over Maduro's capture and who shout every day against American imperialism. So, I'm counting on your vote now to show the power of our community. But, Paulo, this document released by Marco Rubio, it is the continuation of a war that began on January 20th, 2025, when Trump took office as President of the United States. And now they've revealed the connections between all these agents: PCC, Comando Vermelho, the cartels, China, Russia, and Lula, Paulo Henrique.
That's right, my friend. Look, it was something that was a bombshell on Monday, right? So we had the release of this document. Was it on Monday, July 20th? I think it was on Monday. It was on Monday now, Monday, right? On July 20th, then, we had the release of this bombshell, which is the document titled Translating to English Cuba, the Capital of 21st Century Communism. And for me, it was a surprise because I studied this topic, right, Shimon? For more than 10 years, I have been, deeply involved in this. I have 2 books on the subject. And I did a 2-hour show when this document came out. And my team has already done a huge job translating this document into Portuguese. By the way, Shimon, if you authorize it, we can leave the link here in the description of this video so people can download the full report. For people to watch, for people to read. This document, which lays out all the historical background, and in the historical introduction, it shows all the influence that Cuba had, the tricontinental, several points, right, which I already talked about in my work, about the São Paulo Forum and everything else. But he goes on pointing out and showing all the points of funding, guerrillas, and then Brazil comes into play. Brazil, it comes in still from a somewhat more distant angle, and we have to understand why. Because today there is a government in Brazil that is aligned with Cuba, and this government aligned with Cuba still needs to have diplomatic relations. So I believe that a lot was taken out of that document for American strategic reasons. But I don't doubt that in the future this could be added or new versions of this document could be updated. But regarding Brazil, they talk about the guerrillas that were financed by schemes linked to organized crime, which was also financed by Cuba. It talks about Carlos Marighella, and about how the mini manual of the urban guerrilla was also used by the Cuban regime itself to destabilize various situations across Latin America. And it talks about a Brazilian named Tiago Avila. This Tiago Avila, who was even at Greta's flotilla and everything, has connections with Cuban schemes. But the level of detail we have there on various aspects is well addressed here at this point. Right, what Marco Rubio published in this report, which is on the US State Department website, says the following: Cuba's attack on the United States was never really about economic policy, sovereignty, or even ownership of a particular territory. It was a revolution against Western civilization itself, carried out in part by the innovative and insidious method of persuading the children of the West to turn against their own heritage. And then, Shimon, for me, this paragraph from the State Department is like a nuclear bomb in my head because few people understand what Patria Grande is. People think that Patria Grande is just, no, let's make a kind of union of left-wing countries and that's it. No, Patria Grande is much more than that. So much so that after I wrote my first book about the Sao Paulo Forum, I said, I need to update this quickly because what we really have, the issue of Patria Grande, the thinking of Simon Bolivar, that's more important than communism itself for these people. Pay attention to what I'm saying, folks. The idea of Patria Grande is bigger than communism in the midst of all this. And that's exactly what this paragraph from the State Department says in this part here, Shimon. Look, partly waged by the innovative and insidious method of persuading the children of the West to turn against their own heritage. Who are the children of the West? We in the Americas, the United States, Canada, all of Latin America, right? Spanish America, Brazil. We are the children of the West. We have the heritage of Western civilization, and that's exactly what it's talking about. Shimon, this is just a sentence. And I am increasingly impressed with Marco Rubio, but this is immensely profound. It's about an entire civilizational structure that the left has built. And that communism, I'm not saying that communism isn't important, it's extremely important, but it's just dressed up as ideas to actually deepen all of this. It's one of the tools. Yeah, it's a tool for that purpose. This here is just too big. And then, Shimon, if you allow me, I even mentioned an article I wrote, which is short, but I'd like to read it here because you used a very apt term, actually an expression just now, about Brazil becoming a new Cuba. And when people hear that, they think it's from an economic point of view, but Brazil is not going to end up in the same economic situation as Cuba or Venezuela. Let's stay calm, fasten your seatbelts, because I don't think that's impossible, but that's not even the point. The point is that the day before this report came out, I wrote an article. It seemed like I was predicting it because I have. I've been very worried about this diplomatic crisis because it's not just a matter of Lula and Trump fighting. No, this says a lot about what the future of Brazil will be and maybe what we are going to lose and won't be able to recover, my dear. And I wrote this article, and it's totally related to what comes out in this report later. If you allow me, I'll read it here in about a minute and a half. It's really quick. Let's go, of course. Shimon, the future, diplomatic and geopolitical future of Brazil in the 2026 elections. In the current scenario of a new global Cold War, a re-election of Lula would put Brazil in a worrying position, the new Cuba. And relax, it's not about the Caribbean islands' economic situation, but its geopolitical position. The new United States national security doctrine is based on the principle that the entire American continent must be free from external spheres of influence, especially from China, but also from Russia and Iran. The Trump administration has been taking a series of measures to guarantee this zone of influence in the region, deeply reshaping military, economic, and political alignments. We've already discussed this a lot here today. Most Latin American countries are joining this movement and gaining competitive advantages from a geostrategic point of view. Lula, through Celso Amorim, knows exactly what's at stake. The Brazilian government understands that, in the face of the imminent collapse of the regimes in Cuba and Nicaragua, the Workers' Party will be left with the role of a rallying point and center of resistance for the revolutionary movement on the continent. Brazil would thus come to occupy the same role that Cuba played for the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but this time serving the interests of the Communist Party of China. The Chinese presence is increasingly embedded in the country's structures, industry, agriculture and livestock, mining, logistics, electric power, infrastructure, communication, media, and of course, politics. This year's election has much more at stake than most Brazilians realize. Perhaps not even the opposition candidates are fully aware of this. I don't want to sound fatalistic by treating an election as the end of everything, but in the global context we are in, with the geopolitical reshaping of the continent underway, the scenario is quite bleak.
And the scenario is frightening. You were talking, and I remembered the More Doctors program. Right? In fact, this program is mentioned in that document there, right? The sending of military personnel and Cuban agents into Brazil and other countries, right? And what Cuba did here with the Cuban doctors was the same thing that China does with the Chinese and Brazilians. Currently at the Bioet factory BYD. The state would keep, I don't know if it was 20 or 80 or 90% of these doctors' salaries.
It ranged from 75 to 90%, Shimon. And in my book, I have all this data, the variables, the investigation, where it went, how it was done, my friend, this whole process. But it's true. From 75 to 90%, it varied depending on the employee.
So Trump did his homework. And here's even my criticism of the Brazilian right. Bolsonaro didn't do his homework, right? There was Professor Olavo de Carvalho, who said some things, but later he also ended up distancing himself from Bolsonarism in a less political way. He even made some criticisms after that. Right? And then we didn't have any more scholars. I'm talking on a national level, at the presidential level, like Trump, revealing this to the world. It's Trump who's doing it. He's taking the mask off the globalist project, which merged with Islamic radicalism, and not just talking, but denouncing it. They've already put military, economic, and legal mechanisms in place to hunt down all these people, guys. They won't just keep calling Lula a communist. They're not just going to keep pointing fingers. Look, they met in Cuba, and the plan is to take over Brazil. No. They're going after these guys and they're catching them. They're activating mechanisms that even I get scared of. Some mechanisms that Trump is activating now because there are certain doors you open and can't close anymore. And we know there are no guarantees. There's no guarantee at all that Marco Rubio will be the next president of the United States. We don't have those guarantees. A communist guy could get in again, someone like Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, right? Although we are also seeing the political mechanisms in the United States being changed, right? Because they were shaped to elect left-wing candidates and leave Republican candidates out, right? Yeah, so Trump is doing his homework, which Bolsonaro didn't have time to do, right? And I also think there's still a lack, Paulo Henrique Araujo, of this more academic aspect in Brazilian politics, which is understanding what the left is, understanding what it is, what mechanisms they use. It's not just about, bathroom issues, bathroom topics, right? Yeah, identity politics, LGBTQ issues and other things. That's not it. That's just the surface. Because the system is much deeper than that, including this issue of gender ideology. It's bait to distract the population who keep debating this on TV, on the radio, on the internet, while they move mountains behind the scenes. So I see that it's really a paradigm shift, right? I don't want to be that cheerleader here, like you said, right? I don't want to be that cheerleader saying Trump has already won the war. But the world is changing during this second term of Donald Trump. And then I understand, Paulo Henrique Araujo, why are they trying to kill this president in every possible way? Because he's messing with the foundations of hell, right? Many power schemes are being torn apart with Trump and Marco Rubio.
That's right, my friend. Look, I've been saying for about a year and a half, ever since Trump took office, that we are witnessing a geopolitical earthquake. And this earthquake, it's going to take a while for these tectonic plates to settle, and we're going to see a lot of ugly things. On both sides, okay? We're going to see things that won't be pretty from all sides, and it's going to take time for this to settle. I imagine at least 10 years. And the question I ask my Brazilian brothers is, Where will we be in all this? My God, we just have to think about what lies ahead. Think hard, okay, everyone, about what's going to happen in October here in Brazil from now on. Think about it, because the next electoral cycle will determine which side of the scale Brazil will be on in this earthquake. And things are looking bad. Things are looking bad. And what's at stake is totalitarianism. It's the rise of totalitarianism again, right, Shimon? It's a movement very similar to what we saw in the 1930s of the last century. And there are a lot of people jumping on the totalitarian bandwagon, both on the left and on the right, okay? There are even a lot of people here in Brazil who claim to be on the right, but are actually on the totalitarian bandwagon. And what's the big problem? You mentioned the academic side, but it's more than that. The intellectual part is missing. The right doesn't have an intellectual project, which is something very common outside of Brazil. Yeah, the intellectuals provide the whole foundation for what the political parties will be. And that's exactly where we're seeing a big infiltration of intellectuals of revolutionary views, especially Russians. Let's discuss that another time, Shimon, and explore it more then. We can talk about that because there's a whole structure that's being uncovered here in the United States. And in Brazil, we're talking a lot about Russian infiltration, about Guinismo, and many other points, and these need to be discussed. And since December 2025 here in the United States, there's been a real war. There's scrutiny within the Republican Party among the left because that's the magic of the Russians, right? They managed to control both sides of politics. They say that both sides want it, and there are organic and institutional intellectuals for all of this. And while the right in Brazil doesn't develop the intellectual field and value it, because, for example, Professor Olavo de Carvalho, he passed away, but his writings remain. Others, like Plinio Correa de Oliveira, their writings are still available. There's no such thing as studying, having a philosophical foundation, understanding what we're talking about. And that's exactly when they use organic intellectuals to put out all kinds of absurd ideas that we see. Because if the base doesn't have understanding, lacks education, any nice sounding speech becomes a political platform. And then, my friend, things get very dangerous. Chimao?
Yeah, no, and the discussion here is still about supermarket prices, right? The discussion is still corruption in Congress, right? That's the agenda. We can't get out of this, right? We can't. That's part of it.
But that's just the surface, right? It's just the surface.
Exactly. Well, look, I want a keyword. I'll give you 2 keywords for you who are watching, for you who want to support this video, right? This chat of ours. I want you to sponsor this conversation with Paulo Henrique Araujo directly from the United States so that thousands of Brazilians can watch this lesson we had here. So what are you going to do? You're going to write 2 keywords now and you're going to sponsor it. Give us a thumbs up so the algorithm can push our video out, okay? You're going to write Go Trump. That is Go Trump, go get them, right? And no new Cuba here. These 2 phrases, Go Trump and No New Cuba here, write them below now in the comments for real. So the algorithm understands that this is relevant, that this is important, and shows it to more people. And if you can send a little tip of 2 reais, $2, okay? The algorithm will understand that the content is worth it because you're sponsoring this video, right? It's a way for you to sponsor people who bring a different perspective of the world. And if you also want a class with Paulo Henrique here about Russian and Chinese infiltration within the right wing, within Brazilian conservatism, comment here. I want that lesson. Just say that and we'll know the message you want us to bring to the channel, okay? Now subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell and like the video. It takes work to make it. I left here the list of books by Paulo Henrique Araujo that talk about the São Paulo Forum, right? That talk about how Brazilian democracy failed, It's all here. And it's really cool because it talks about how the left took power inside the United States, the shadow party. I'm forgetting 2, Paulo. There are 5 books, right? Which 2 am I missing?
There's also the Revolutionary Foundations of Modern Politics, which talks a lot about this ideological issue, right? And there's also the basics about the São Paulo Forum.
My friends, this puts us on the edge of a historic abyss. The year 2026 will not be just another electoral contest in Brazil, it will be an existential referendum. Either Brazil embraces alignment with the shield of the Americas, eradicating the parasite doctrine from our institutions, or we will be permanently consumed and devoured by a system that protects and idolizes crime. The final lesson of this geopolitical chess game is inviolable. The nation that does not control its own territory loses control of its narrative and inevitably becomes hostage and slave to its adversary. And the reality is that in your business, the law is exactly the same. Today, the most valuable currency is attention. And I am recruiting 5 entrepreneurs and professionals who are the best at what they do, but are invisible here on social media in the digital world. What hurts the most is having a great business and nobody knowing that you exist. It's having great knowledge but not being able to share it with anyone, while it seems like only dances or memes are going viral. I used to think the same way. 15 years ago on radio and television, I understood that building authority depends purely on content and a solid strategy. The game now is about media, my friend. Look at the examples of Cimet, a pharmaceutical company, and Havan Stores. Both of them tripled their sales the moment they understood they also needed to be a media company. You need to get in front of the cameras. The reality is that your identity cannot be outsourced. The owner needs to show up and lead the vision. Because that time is over when you could just record with your phone any way you wanted, with no authority at all, and still achieve your goals here. The digital world today demands absolute professionalism. If you want to break through the bubble, be recognized, and build an empire by using the exact system that brings me 50 million views every month on my social networks, and even more monetized in dollars. Pay attention here. On August 16th, I will host an intensive workshop, 100% in person, face-to-face with me here in my studio in Curitiba, together with my professional team. It will be a practical, exclusive meeting. There are only 5 spots left. I will personally support, guide, and direct you in building your authority so your business can stand out in a powerful way. The QR code is showing on the screen, the link is in the description and in the first pinned comment, but there are only 5 spots. When the last spot is filled, the steel door closes and that's it. You'll have to wait. So click the button that's on the screen now and access the link. I'll be waiting for you to bulletproof your communication. And for those who are tired of wasting time looking for a good movie or a good series to watch with the family on the weekend, spending an hour browsing the catalog, and in the end it's complete garbage or some woke stuff full of whining. We created a channel with recommendations for TV shows and movies. So check out our channel, subscribe, like it, because I'm going to treat you to wonderful, fantastic tips. Just pick a title, make some popcorn, and enjoy with your family. All right? Link in the description, in the pinned comment, and in the card that appears on your screen. And you can also become a member and get early access to our channel's content. Subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and leave a like on the video because it takes a lot of work to make. My friends, now shield your mind. Yes, shield your mind. I'm Shimon Oliveira, and I'll see you in the next video. See you then.